country has, in its wisdom, contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived, or his imagination conceived. That's what John Adams wrote in a letter to Abigail Adams in 1793. He was beginning his second term as Vice President of the United States. It's a thankless job, largely ceremonial and the ultimate in contingency planning. And as the second president, like so many other executives in unfamiliar situations, particularly those in startups, Adams had to determine what he was going to maintain and what paths he was going to have to forge for himself. It was an unenviable task, following as he did the great George Washington. But, as you're about to hear, if anyone was up for it was John Adams.
There are certain values and practices that withstand the test of time. As Goethe wrote, "He who cannot draw on 3,000 years is living hand to mouth." Timeless leadership connects the stories and experiences of modern leaders with lessons of the past that we know to be beautiful, useful, or true. Through the swirling maelstrom of change and uncertainty that perpetually threaten progress, our North Stars are character, culture, communication, and other timeless principles. This is where leaders learn. This is timeless leadership.
Hi, I'm Scott Monty. Welcome back to Timeless Leadership. I'm glad you're here with me to discuss things that are beautiful, useful, or true about leadership. And thanks to our guest today, we're going to learn about how one of the architects of the United States government made sure we had something that took the form of all three of those things. And I'd like you to pay particular attention to what she says toward the end of our discussion when she talks about the quality of restraint, particularly in moments of crisis and uncertainty. This actually fits really well with the newsletter I just did last week about who we need to trust in times of crisis. And just a reminder, if you don't already, please subscribe to the show on whatever podcast platform you happen to be listening to us on. We're available essentially everywhere you get podcasts. And if you could, while you're there in that app, leave a rating or review for the show. It would help to boost our engagement and help other people find what we're doing. And if you'd like to find out more about me, you can check me out at scottmonty.com. I go out and speak to groups of people, leaders and their teams, boards of directors, companies at industry gatherings, and I talk about building a cohesive culture and operating in crises and better communication and of course, the power of storytelling. If you're interested in learning about how we might put something together, check out the link in the show notes to my speaking page at scottmonty.com. Dr. Lindsay M. Chervinsky is a historian of the presidency and political culture and the government. She's the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library. Her research can be found in publications from op-eds to books, speaking on podcasts and other media, and teaching for every kind of audience. Dr. Chervinsky's book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution, was published in 2020. She also co-edited Mourning the President's Loss and Legacy in American Culture in 2023. She's a regular guest on podcasts and appears frequently on Listening to America. And you may recall she appeared right here on Timeless Leadership on episode 53. She's the creator of the Audible course, The Best and Worst Presidential Cabinets in U.S. History. Her newest book, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic, was published in September. Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, welcome back to Timeless Leadership.
Thank you so much for having me back. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Well, the last time we were here, you and I were talking about George Washington and the cabinet and how he essentially invented something that there were no provisions for in the Constitution. He, as a military leader, knew he had to convene a council of people for input. It was really the hallmark of an executive. And now we are on to John Adams in your latest book, Making the Presidency. And what's interesting to me is that as we look back in history, we just take these things for granted. Okay, you had a first president, and now you have a second president. It's just a free flow. Well, when you're in the moment, when you are John Adams, when you are George Washington and their colleagues, they didn't have a roadmap. They didn't know where they were going. And here John Adams is living in George Washington's shadow for 8 years at least, if not more. And now he has to make his own way. So I'm curious as to what kind of a man, what kind of a leader you can sum up John Adams as. And then we'll get into some of the details.
Well, I love how you set that up because I do think that this is something that's actually quite applicable to so many scenarios. You know, when people found businesses or organizations, one of the biggest challenges is that succession planning and trying to figure out who will take over once you're no longer the CEO or the president of an organization. And the challenges that go with that are compounded when you're talking about a government and you're talking about a nation at which, you know, the stakes are so incredibly high. And so for John Adams, I think that what's most important to know about him was he was deeply experienced, especially at foreign policy and his understanding of how constitutions work. So he had a great deal of confidence in his own knowledge about executive power, if not necessarily how to use it, but at least theoretical and what was maybe intended for the Constitution, but then also how the world worked. And that was hard-won expertise that he had really endured for years and years abroad. And that knowledge was pretty rare in the United States because so few people had had those experiences. And then the second piece was he had a stubborn obstinacy to him, which was sort of like a righteous obstinacy, in which when he felt that he was doing something that was right, he was happy to be unpopular. He didn't mind, you know, if people disliked what he did or if it meant that he was breaking from his party or that it would challenge his future electoral prospects. I mean, he didn't want to lose, of course, but he was willing to take that hit if he felt that it was the right thing to do. And he demonstrated that characteristic as early as the 1770s when he represented the Boston soldiers in the Boston Massacre, which was an unpopular thing to do with his neighbors at the time. And then he demonstrated it again and again as president.
This is interesting because to me, we are so lacking in examples of integrity in leadership today, particularly the high profile leaders that we see for the most part. And when people do act with integrity, it's celebrated as something that is unusual. How unusual was that kind of integrity in Adams's day?
Well, I certainly think it was less unusual. I mean, I don't want to suggest that politics was any cleaner or more sanitized or any more polite, because the 1790s were nasty and the newspapers had no compunction about just printing outright lies. There was no standard of, journalistic ethics. And so the newspapers were full of garbage. There were a lot of really nasty behind the scenes campaigns. There was a lot of intra-party fighting. So within Adams' own party, some of the more extreme members referred to him as an evil to be endured, which is shocking language when you're talking about a president from your own party. And so I don't want to give the sense that it was perfect or that everyone involved with politics were these great men. But I do think that there was a sense of shared commitment to creating something bigger. And a republic really required constant participation and constant rededication to ensuring that it would survive. And I talk about this concept of what I call civic virtue in the book, which is putting the Constitution or the Republic above one's own political and partisan interests. And there are several moments where key players do that across the book in in a way that they understood what they were doing. They understood that maybe they would take a political hit, but it would help the nation survive. And that, I think, is something that we would definitely like to see with some frequency.
Yeah, I was struck as I read this book about the parallels with where we are today. And look, you wrote this book last year, and you didn't know all of the machinations things were going to take, and decisions that were going to be made, who the candidates were ultimately going to be. So it's fascinating to me to watch this play out in parallel. And I think what we get is a message of consistency of human nature, of the things that we're fighting for. And you said something there that really struck me, being part of something bigger than themselves. I think this is essential in any leader, whether you're leading a small business, whether you're leading a country, doesn't matter. Getting your people to share a vision and to work towards something greater than yourself. There's a certain sense of not only professional satisfaction, but living with purpose. And I think from what I could understand, certainly in knowing about John Adams outside of this range that you've talked about, he was a man who was driven by purpose, a higher purpose for serving his fellow man, his country, etc. What can you talk about in terms of that internal drive, perhaps, that Adams had?
Well, I just want to pick up on one thing you said before I turn to John Adams in particular. I think perhaps one of the things that makes this moment unique is that so many of the people who were participating in politics had previously participated in the Revolutionary Project, whether it was in the army or it was in Congress or state government during the Revolution. They had skin in the game of creating this nation. And so I think to a certain extent that bigger goal of ensuring it survived was so much more front of mind and center on what their long-term goals were to achieve. And so I think, when we look today at our government or we look at politicians today, I think a lot of Americans really take for granted that, of course, the United States is going to survive. Of course, our institutions will continue. And I know, even myself, despite having spent a long time studying these things, I certainly took things like the peaceful transfer of power for granted until 2021. And I think that was a shared experience. And so I think perhaps that's what differs our generation from the previous generations, which is where they had a much better sense of the stakes of what could go wrong if they failed or if they made a bad decision, because they had been so instrumental in helping craft this thing. And John Adams was a perfect example of that. His entire family was devoted to the Revolutionary Project. He had, of course, served in Europe for years. He had served in Congress. His sons had gone with him. Abigail had sacrificed and had been without him for years while he was abroad, and then she went with him to Europe. And so they intimately understood what they were fighting for, both during the war and then when they were in positions of leadership, of trying to create this new thing and ensure that it survives. And we know that creating new stuff is really hard. It's really easy to tear things down. It's much harder to build something and make sure that it endures. And so I think that one of his strengths as president was really his long-term vision, his understanding of what the purpose was of this thing, and an ability to put himself above the partisan fray to focus on the long-term survival of the republic.
And that's interesting, because he was a president who not only had to deal with the usual partisan politics, which, we all know how Washington kind of predicted what was to come when you've got party politics, but it wasn't just the typical party politics. He was fighting, or at least having to battle against, members of his own cabinet. He was dealing with governing and administering in the shadow of George Washington. And any president that followed Washington was going to have a difficult standard to live up to. And at the same time, he was dealing with all kinds of foreign intrigue and foreign policy entanglements that were pretty complex and also uncertain at the time. We didn't know how things were going to turn out in France with their little project with respect to revolution. So here's Adams in the middle of these many multifaceted challenges, where did he find the strength to take on each one of these three separate and important areas that he was challenged with?
Yeah, it's such a big and good question, because I do think that we often, and one of the things that drew me to Adams is that we forget how difficult it must have been to follow Washington. Washington was such an unparalleled figure in American history and was so revered by the American people that anyone who came after him was just going to have a terrible time. It was going to be awful, and they knew it. I mean, even Thomas Jefferson knew it. He said he didn't want to be president after Washington. And so, to a certain extent, that stubborn obstinacy that I talked about with Adams' willingness to do what was needed if it meant being unpopular really came into play with that challenge. Is he understood that someone just had to show up. Someone had to be there and be willing to fight for the presidency to ensure that it would work for other people in a way that required tremendous willpower and staying power, and also political courage to show up in that moment and just endure it. At one point, a newspaper described him as this particular kind of horse, and it was called like an old fielder. I think I'm getting that term correct. And it was basically like a small little horse that was a really good work animal on the farm and was prized because it just had it wasn't flashy, it wasn't super fast, but it had great endurance and could work really hard with relatively little food. And Adams loved that description of himself because that was what he felt he brought to the table, an ability to grind it out. And he did. And that grind came into play when he was battling his own cabinet, which he kept from Washington's administration and established a precedent for his successor. So that's not what you want to do. You really need your own cabinet when you come into the presidency, because he was willing to battle them for what the character of the executive would look like. His cabinet was trying to create an executive that was much more like the Privy Council, where it was shared executive authority. And he fought back against that, trying to ensure that Washington's precedent of the president really being in charge and the cabinet secretaries being subordinate to that person would endure. And I like to describe it as he was very tenacious and he was stubbornly defensive about executive power, but not necessarily his own. It wasn't that he wanted to be super powerful. It was that he wanted this office to be super powerful. And then the last big threat that you mentioned was the foreign policy piece. And this is where his expertise comes into play, because he understood exactly how European nations worked on the world stage and what they were motivated by. And he was able to withstand the immediate impulses to go to war with France, recognizing that war wasn't really in France's interest or in the United States' interests, and instead neutrality was much more important. And he wouldn't have been able to do that if he hadn't had so much experience in Europe prior to coming to the presidency.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that is largely underrated, but so necessary at the time. And in addition, Adams also had the experience of the vice presidency. And we almost think nowadays of the vice presidency as an apprenticeship, if you will, for the presidency. That, you know, you're getting on-the-job experience, so you know what to expect. I was, well, I won't say thrilled. I was enthralled to discover that Adams was largely isolated from Washington's cabinet. He was not included in cabinet meetings. He was not included in correspondence. And when he showed up 7 years later to hear that, oh, Washington is going to be resigning after his second term, it came as a huge shock to him. He was responsible for overseeing the Senate, and that's pretty much it. And he had a phrase, I think, that he coined about the office of the vice presidency, about how essentially useless it is. Talk a little bit about him being in that position and how he may have been more sympathetic or perhaps mirrored what Washington did in his own administration.
Yeah, John Adams hated the vice presidency. It was the worst possible position for him because there was nothing to do other than, have a pulse. And that he was not somebody who, with his incredible energy and capacity for work, did well with no responsibility. And so when he came into the presidency, he had the only experience of having a vice president from a different party. So Thomas Jefferson became the vice president. He was of the opposition party. That was due to a loophole in the Constitution, the way that they were elected, and that was changed with the 12th Amendment. And so Adams is the only president that's had a vice president from the opposition, and he really hoped that he could create a bipartisan administration. He wanted to work with Jefferson. He felt that Jefferson's sort of bona fides with France would help avoid war and could bring the country together. And I do think he really tried to do so. I think a couple of things got in his way. One, his cabinet was much more extreme than he was and really wanted to take advantage of winning and make the most of the partisan opportunities that came with winning. And so they wanted to sideline Jefferson, and they did not trust Jefferson in any way. And Adams initially sort of had to accede to those wishes because he was trying to avoid a split in his administration. The second key piece is that Jefferson initially maybe had, I think, good thoughts that he might be able to work with Adams. They had had a long relationship. They were very close, and he thought highly of him, but very quickly allowed himself to think the worst of Adams all the time. And so whenever anything happened, he always interpreted what Adams was doing or saying or what was happening around them in the worst possible light. And if they had just stopped to talk to one another, I think they would have found that in a lot of ways their opinions were, if not necessarily aligned, at least much closer to each other than they might have thought. And so instead, Jefferson met with the French minister to the United States and encouraged France not to sign a treaty with Adams and said, wait 3 years and then I'll be in office and give you a much better deal, which is shockingly close to treason given the United States was almost at war with this country. He stirred up a lot of trouble at the state level and in Congress, and really, I think, is probably one of the all-time worst vice presidents.
Jefferson does not come off as the most sympathetic character in this particular account. And look, I think what we discover as we go back and thanks to the hard work of historians like you, we get inside the heads and hearts of some of these individuals, is we find they're just humans. We put them on a pedestal, the founding fathers, as if they were coming down from Olympus or something, when in fact they were doing the best they know how, just as we would today if there was something that we were trying to build. And I think that's very apparent in your narrative, and humanizing that and finding ourselves in them and finding them in ourselves is something that's reassuring, because like Adams, Adams was a scholar. He was well studied. He understood history, particularly classical antiquity. And that in turn, I think, helped ground him for what to expect. Because we look back at this and it's a certainty. Of course, there's going to be a third president and a fourth and on, and the republic will stand. Well, nothing was a certainty there. And I think you said it before, that Adams knew he had to fight and fight hard for this, and was guided by history and guided by the knowledge of human nature. And I think that's a lesson we can still take to heart today.
Oh, I completely agree. I actually think that embracing their flaws is really quite useful, because if flawed humans in the past can do extraordinary things, which they did, that means that flawed humans in our present can do extraordinary things. And we don't have to look for these godlike figures. We don't have to hope that there's a second coming of, some flawless generation. So to me, that's actually like a really useful discovery and a really useful realization that I think we should be excited about, that it's great that they are real people with petty motivations and grudges and, get angry with one another and make mistakes, because that makes their successes so much more appealing and also so much more striking to us. I think that Adams' understanding of history, but also the context that they were living in is so important to this moment. As Americans today, we are not always very well read about foreign policy. But Americans in the 1790s were keenly aware of what was happening around the world because they were such a new nation, and the future of their nation and their economy and their trade and everything that they experienced was really shaped across the high seas because they were not a global superpower. And so the context that they were living in was the French Revolution. And you alluded to this earlier, but the French Revolution had a series of turmoils, and we tend to think of the Reign of Terror where innocent people were slaughtered at the guillotine. But that was just one piece, and they certainly had that on their mind. But after that, the French Revolution had gone through a series of sort of constitutional coups where the Directory would throw out people and sort of rewrite things, and there was incredible legal and political turmoil. And this was very much front of mind for Adams, for Jefferson, for Washington, that of course they wanted to avoid the guillotine, but they also wanted to avoid this constitutional turmoil that they were seeing. And it certainly made Adams have a pretty sharp understanding about the worst impulses of humans and humanity in general.
One thing I wanted to kind of pull out here is in those days, in the late 1700s, America was still very people in America had very specific identities with respect to their geography. To be a New Englander was something different than being the landed gentry. And you've got this cabal of Virginians, right? You've got George Washington, you've got Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, right? The first 5 presidents there, only one of them was a standout. This lone little farmer, this workhorse from Massachusetts. Talk a little bit about the geographical sensibilities and perhaps how that played into how these leaders interacted with each other.
I'm really glad you brought this up because, for most of his life, Jefferson referred to himself as a Virginian first and then an American. And that is an astonishing thing for a president to say. But it's really important because the country was so new, the national identity and the national ties, the emotional ties between citizens and this new nation and this new federal government were really quite flimsy. And that meant that regional culture was extra important, especially at a time when most people didn't go that far from home. So one of my favorite facts to demonstrate this was in 1774 when the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia for the first time. More delegates had traveled to London than had traveled to Philadelphia. And that demonstrates where their thinking was, like where they were associating. They were associating with the homeland. They were not associating with one another. Now, of course, by the 1790s, more people had traveled because there had been a Congress and there was a seat of government and there had been a war. So the army had traveled up and down the nation. But generally speaking, people didn't go that far from home. And when you did go far from home, you sought out people who were from where you were to spend time with. So for the people who went to Philadelphia for Congress, if you were from New England, you sought out your fellow New Englanders. And that's who you tended to lodge with. And that's who you tended to socialize with. And that meant that it was religious, it was cultural, it was educational, it was your language, your dialect, that was shaped by your region. And, I set Washington aside a little bit because he was quite explicit that if push came to shove, he would pick the Union over Virginia. And he really was sort of a national figure because he had traveled so much during the war and had traveled so much during the presidency and had really seen the United States. But Jefferson and Madison and Monroe, who were the 3 big leaders in the first Republican Party, the Jeffersonian Republican Party, their Virginianness meant a great deal and shaped how they thought about the federal government. It shaped how they thought about states' rights. It shaped how they approached legislation or combating legislation. And I think the same was true for the Federalist Party, whose real seat of power was located in New England, and the most extreme wings was especially located in Massachusetts.
Well, as a native New Englander myself, I'll pledge allegiance to John Adams and the Republic.
I do have to say, so just as a hilarious little side note, whenever I do events, I always ask because I have some not very nice things to say about Timothy Pickering, who was the Secretary of State at the time. It's terrible. And so I usually ask, I'm like, are there any Pickering descendants in the audience before I start talking about him? And thankfully, I haven't run into any thus far, but I do have some more New England events, so we'll see how that goes, and maybe I'll have to temper my language a little bit.
That's funny. That's funny. Well, just as an aside, I discovered just last year, after having done no genealogy research myself, that on my father's side, we are descendants of John and Priscilla Alden from the Mayflower. So,
Oh, that's fantastic.
I take my Massachusetts stock very seriously.
As you should. It's a very proud heritage.
Indeed, indeed. So, wrapping up here, as we think about the legacy of John Adams, he's not one of the most high-profile presidents. He only had one term, living in the shadow of Washington. Of course, bookended between Washington and Jefferson. That's difficult for anyone, and only as a one-termer, which, as we know, was tumultuous. The 1800 election was one that was contested hotly. But when we think of all of this, in sum, and we've got, this great biography that you've done about this particular period of time, how do you want the public to remember John Adams?
Well, I think as a general principle, I would really like people to stop assuming that one-term presidents are failures, because often their successes and their contributions have nothing to do with what electoral politics look like in any given year. About John Adams in particular, I think that they should remember him for three things. First, showing up and proving that someone else could be president. And that was a live question in 1797, whether this office would work for anyone else. Second, actively and ardently defending the character of the presidency as defined by Washington, such that future presidents would enjoy the same sort of executive power, have the ability to set foreign policy, to hire and fire the people of their choosing. That was really largely John Adams' doing, because Washington's decisions and use of executive power was so often unchecked or unchallenged. And so it was Adams who had those decisions challenged and met that challenge. The last piece was John Adams was central to the creation of the peaceful transfer of power. He was the common denominator in the first two transitions. He really set the tone for what the transition would look like in 1800 to 1801 and set an incredible model for future presidents to follow long before any of that behavior was required by statute, and it's certainly not in the Constitution. And we have learned that the peaceful transfer of power is something that really depends on the people who are involved and those around them to continue to uphold and cherish this central part of our republic. And I think in 1801, one of the things that Adams did to ensure that that was possible was when the country faced a constitutional crisis, he exercised restraint. And that is not a quality we typically celebrate in presidents because it's quiet. It's behind the scenes, it's not gaudy, it's not sending armies into battle, but it is so essential in moments of crisis and uncertainty. And so I do think he deserves a lot more credit for his presidency than he has previously received.
I really like that last point, that the wisdom to use restraint, that's the ultimate definition of power. It's not, lording over someone and inflicting pain. It's withholding the ability to do that. It's showing that kind of restraint. And I think it's entirely appropriate that John Adams was the first president who resided in the White House for only a few months, too. It was finished in November. The plaster was still drying when he got there. It was a mess. I know Abigail was hanging laundry in the East Room, and it's not the place that we think of today. And yet, there is a wonderful reminder that's still in the White House today. The words that Adams wrote, I think to Abigail. He said, "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." I mean, if Adams could have offered a prayer to the presidency, that really sums it up.
It does. He wrote that after his first night in the White House to Abigail, and John F. Kennedy had it carved into the marble fireplace on the state floor. And it is, I think, the perfect encapsulation of his approach to the presidency and his attempt to ensure that it was stronger than the one he received and that it would survive and serve the American people going forward.
Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, thank you for joining us here on Timeless Leadership. Again, the book is Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic.
Thank you so much for having me. I always really enjoy our conversations.
At a certain point in any leader's career, we find ourselves in an executive position. And it combines our knowledge of the particular industry or subject that we happen to know with our knowledge of people and their motivations. And when you're in that seat, either when someone else has been sitting in it before you, or maybe even if you were the first to sit there, it means you need to be prepared. We need to consider that our words and our actions are going to resonate, no matter how long or how short we sit there. And that means we need to take care to be respectful, not only of those around us, but of the position we've been given. And ultimately, we need to conduct ourselves with character and dignity, just like John Adams. Please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and share it around. In doing so, you can help the next generation of leaders on their journey. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. Our theme music, Timeless Harmony, used with permission, was written by Matthias Leon and performed by the City of Prague Philharmonic Orchestra. I'm Scott Monty. There's so much to learn